Hi, my name is Sean Pittock. I'm a professor of neurology, director of the Neuromyelitis Laboratory, and director of the Centre for MS and Autoimmune Neurology at the Mayo Clinic. I've been working in NMOSD research for approximately the past 20 years. I'm very excited to share some of the results of a recent trial, the CHAMPIONS trial, with you today. So NMOSD is a severe inflammatory disorder that causes inflammation mainly of the optic nerves and the spinal cord. For many years, it was mistaken or misdiagnosed as multiple sclerosis, but in 2004, a biomarker, the water channel antibody, was discovered at the Mayo Clinic, and this really revolutionized our understanding of this condition. The condition can lead to blindness or paraplegia or both. And unfortunately, it's very severe. It's characterized by these relapses or attacks of optic neuritis or transverse myelitis. And each attack can cause significant disability. So it's really, really important in this disease that we stop the clinical attacks. It's different to multiple sclerosis. It has a much worse outcome than multiple sclerosis. And it doesn't seem to have a progressive phase. So in other words, there's no progressive disability in between attacks. The disability is attack related. So if we can stop the attacks, we can prevent morbidity and mortality in this very severe disease. Well, I started working in complement and NMOSD many years ago because what we realized from our studies was that when the AQP4 antibody binds to the water channel target on the astrocyte, it activates complement. This is an inflammatory protein in the blood. And this inflammatory protein kills and injures the astrocyte and causes just mass destruction in the nervous system. So what we realized is that complement plays a major role in causing the injury in the nervous system. So we thought that if we could block complement activation, we could protect patients' brains and spinal cords from this devastating illness. And we were actually right. So what happened was in 2010, we started an open label trial where we treated 14 patients with the drug, and there were dramatic results from that open label trial, and that led to a larger phase 3 trial called the PREVENT trial. And in that trial, we found that eculizumab actually reduced the likelihood of a clinical attack by about 94%. So it was quite a dramatic result. And that actually led to the FDA approval in the US of the medication for NMOSD. The problem is, though, is that patients that are on eculizumab, they have to get an injection or an infusion of eculizumab every 2 weeks. And that can be a real problem, especially for people that are young and they're very active, because that's our objective. We want to keep people really active and going around their daily lives as normal. And so that's why we moved to the Ravulizumab trial, because Ravulizumab is essentially the same drug as eculizumab, except it's been manipulated in such a way that it has a longer half-life. So you only have to give the medications every 8 weeks rather than every 2 weeks. So the CHAMPION study had to have a little tweak to its design, because remember, when the CHAMPION study was being designed, we already knew that eculizumab had such an incredible effect, as I had mentioned earlier. So we weren't able to use a placebo group because we felt that that would be unethical. So what we did was, and this is really important because it's a novel design approach, and it's very important to try and consider this type of design for rare orphan diseases or rare diseases. And so what we did was we used the placebo arm from the PREVENT trial as the comparator arm. In other words, an external comparator for the CHAMPIONS trial. And then, of course, the patients that went into the CHAMPIONS trial, the 58 patients that received ravulizumab for a median of about 75 weeks, those patients knew that they were on the drug. So it wasn't blinded, it was open label. So the primary outcome measure was essentially time to first attack. And we were really excited by the results because we actually had no or zero adjudicated clinical attacks in the entire study. In other words, so no patients, none of the 58 patients had a clinical relapse during the trial. Now, there were 2 physician-reported attacks, but those were adjudicated by the attack adjudication committee as not fulfilling criteria for a clinical attack. So this is kind of as good as it gets. 0 attacks over 75 weeks in the treated patients. And then obviously for the placebo arm patients, there were quite frequent attacks. And when you then looked at risk reduction, the risk reduction works out at about 98.5%. So a very positive result in the study. Overall, the adverse event profile was similar to the known adverse event profile for both eculizumab and ravulizumab. There were 2 patients that had meningococcal infection. One patient had a meningococcal meningitis. The other patient had meningococcal sepsis. So that's important to note. Now, we know that meningococcal infections are more common in patients that are on complement inhibition. So this is a known risk factor for the disease, and there are a variety of different mitigation processes that are in place to try and reduce the likelihood of those 2 infections, but those 2 infections did occur. What I can tell you is that both patients that developed these infections were identified very early. They were treated rapidly, and there were no bad adverse outcomes from those 2 infections. One of the patients decided not to go back in the study. The other patient decided to continue in the trial.